Well, welcome to this version of the seminar that I was hoping to give at the Missions Extravaganza and was unable to. My name is Mike Boone, and I serve as Associate Pastor at Wakefield Central Baptist Church. And today I want to share with you about the life of Joseph, the wisdom of waiting. So if you have your Bible with you and would like to turn to Genesis chapter 34, chapter 30, we will begin. I'm not going to read the verses, but I'm just going to make reference to them, and please feel free to follow me as I go through this time. And as we look at the life of Joseph in these next few minutes. It's interesting that Joseph's name has a dual meaning. First of all, it can mean he takes away, and then secondly, it can mean he shall add. So as we look at the life of Joseph, God took away many things. He took him away from his family and took him away from his home and his land, and then he took him to a strange place, and then all that in between things that were happening to Joseph were preparing him, and then God used the other part of his name, he shall add. And so many things were added to Joseph. He had a family. He became the second most powerful man basically in the world at that particular time. And all of these things happen with, first of all, is God's timing preparation. And it starts off with this special garment that his father gave him, which it was a special garment that he was given, a special coat that he was given. It had many different meanings. Most of us know it as a multicolored, but it was probably more like a long-sleeved robe, and it was long down to your feet. In other words, it was a garment of a leader. It was a garment of royalty. And so with that, the stage is being set for his brothers to be jealous. And then along comes these dreams that God gives him. He has these two dreams about, and of course they're very obvious, that his brothers are going to bow down before him. And then after that, his father and mother are going to bow down before him. And he is seen as the favorite child, and his father makes no bones about that. He makes sure that he is revealed or seen as the one who will be the leader of this family. It's interesting it's not a good thing to favor your children. I have two. And my daughter is always saying, Timothy is the favorite. I said, yeah, you're right. He is our favorite son. He's my favorite son, but you're my favorite daughter. And so it was interesting the last time she was home, she counted the pictures in our living space, and she said, there's more pictures of Timothy than me. And so jealousy is a cruel response. I'm not saying my daughter was jealous, but she was noticing these things that we did not even know. So these are some lessons that we can learn from Joseph's teenage years is don't favor one child over the other if you have more than one. And then we have to remember that no action is more powerful than prayer as we look as well. And so as we move from his teenage years, from birth about 17 thereabout, Joseph, as we look at chapter 39, verse 2, is that he flourishes under difficulties. He's thrown in a pit, and then he is sold as a slave. Then he is taken to a foreign land. And when he gets there, all is going well. All is going well. Then, bam, temptation comes. It says in verse 6, now Joseph was well built and good looking. Poor guy to be good looking and well built. And in verses 8 and 9 of chapter 39, How it tells us how Joseph was able to resist such temptation. He was loyal to his worldly master, and he was loyal to his heavenly master, God. He knew he couldn't hide anything from God. And so to commit this act of adultery with his master's wife may have been hidden on the earth, but he knew that God would know, and so he was loyal to his God. And it's always interesting that the tempter is looking for a respected person, one who has influence, one who is highly regarded in the community, to try and trip up, maybe even a godly person, to try and you know, cause them to stumble and to fall. You know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer once stated, with irresistible power, desire seizes mastery over the flesh. All at once a secret, smoldering fire is kindled. The lust that arouses envelops the mind and will of a man in deepest darkness. The powers of clear discrimination and of decision are taken from us. And so it is. That's seems it just overtakes us as we begin to dwell on that. But Swindoll would state as we look at verses 11 through 20, he says, whenever the New Testament lingers on the subject of sensual temptation, it gives us one command: run. And that is really good advice, and that's exactly what Joseph did. And we notice that Potiphar's wife her lust turned to fury, and she only wanted revenge, even though she was the instigator of this. And all of this indicates that God was seeing far beyond Joseph's present situation. And he is preparing Joseph for what is coming in the years ahead. Then in chapter 39 as well, in verses 21 through 23, we see that God, our Yahweh, extended kindness to Joseph. And this particular word that is used in this passage is that covenant love and loyalty that God gives to us. That is, that God is going to honor his part of the agreement, the covenant that he has made with us, and that is the word that that the writer chooses to describe this kindness of God. And in this passage, we see that God's hand is all on Joseph, and his hand is on Joseph because Joseph obeyed his God. And for obeying his God, what happens? He winds up back in the pit again. In other words, he's having to start all over again from where he started, and now he's having to start over again. Verse 23 of chapter 39 says, "And whatever he did, the Lord made him it successful, or made him successful." That is, he succeeded. This word has the idea of to be in a favorable circumstance. And Swindoll would continue commenting on this passage. He said, the lens of God's will stood between Joseph and his circumstances, enabling Joseph to see God in them and enabling God to use him in them. So he was able to see what God was doing, and we don't find any resentment or bitterness in the life of Joseph at all. He's back in the pit. In verses 1 through 3 of chapter 40, we see that as he's there, he's joined by two of the king or Pharaoh's officials, the baker and the cupbearer. And remember, they had dreams, and they told Joseph the dreams, and Joseph was able to interpret those dreams by God's help. And so the cupbearer's dream was favorable. And Joseph asked him one favor. He said, when you get back into your position, just remember me. Don't forget, because he knew that many times people that that had been in prison and were in the position such as a cupbearer, they had some influence with with Pharaoh. Um, but what happened? Joseph was forgotten. As he's being faithful and as he's obeying God, he is forgotten. But he was free from bitterness. And being free from bitterness, God is able to use us in a very powerful way. So whatever's happened, whatever going on with you, if things difficult are happening to you, just try and not allow bitterness to take root in your life, so that God can use you. Bitterness is there. God's not going to be able to remember you. So of course this would lead to Joseph's disappointment. In verse 23 of chapter 40, he was not remembered, but he was forgotten. And in chapter 41, verse 1, it says, after 2 years' time, Pharaoh dreamed. 2 more years had to pass. Now, we just read one chapter, then read the next, and go to the next page. But we're talking about 2 years. 2 whole years pass, and then Pharaoh has this dream. And C.S. Lewis wrote a statement that has always resonated with me since I read it many years ago. In The Problem of Pain, he said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. And is that not true? That God shouts in our pains. And Lewis would call this God's megaphone. That pain seems to draw us, and either it brings us closer to God, or it pushes us further away. But God shouts to us one way or the other. And he is trying to get our attention, possibly. Joseph had 2 choices. He could be disillusioned and bitter, is what he could do, or he could see these as opportunities to place his hope and his trust in God. That God had not forgotten him. Yes, he'd been forgotten, but God had not forgotten him. And as he will see later on in his life, is that God was preparing him. God was preparing him for something great, And so we have this test that comes. And A.W. Tozier made a statement that I think is really, really important for us to understand. He says, it is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. Until you and I experience some kind of brokenness, whatever it is, God can use us, yes, but when we've been broken, it's amazing how much greater God seems to use us, because there are so many broken people around us, and our brokenness will resonate with others' brokenness. And so there's a wisdom in this waiting to see how God is going to use our situation and our circumstances. And this waiting is shaping Joseph for the future plans that God and the future that God sees, and Joseph's going to be a part of that future, and the purpose that he's going to serve in that is going to be life changing, and going to be life giving to so many people. And then in chapter 41, 1 through 8, Pharaoh has a dream. I mean, Joseph has 2 dreams, and he interprets 2 dreams, and here comes Pharaoh, and he's having some dreams, and nobody in his cabinet, or his wise men, his magicians, and all of these, no one could interpret his dream. So in verses 9 through 14 of chapter 41, we see that the cupbearer said, I must make mention today of my offenses. And he goes on and he says that he had a dream, and who interpreted it, and the Pharaoh said, well, go get this man now. Go get this Joseph and bring him to me. So Joseph is remembered in these verses. So he starts off in the pit. He makes his way to Pharaoh's house, where he rises to the top. Boom. He goes to the pit again, and now he's out of the pit, and now he stands before the throne of the most powerful man in the world in that day, in verses 15 and 16. It's amazing that when God's plan is set in motion, it's set quickly. It goes. God prepares. He takes ample time to prepare us, and all of this. Then boom, he moves with his plan and where we fit in that plan. And so Joseph, the answer that Joseph gives in verses 15 and 16, it says here in verse 16, not I, but God will see to Pharaoh's welfare, according to the Hebrew translation. It has this idea that God is concerned about the peace of Pharaoh, a man who doesn't worship this God, but who believes himself to be a God. But the Almighty is concerned for the peace of Pharaoh, his welfare. And so in verses 37 and 40 through 40 of chapter 41, Joseph gets his promotion. He's now in the position, he's now in the place where God wants him. And so he has learned to wait on God's timing, on God's preparation. He's learned that. And then in verses 41 through 45 of that same chapter, Joseph is restored. He's given a new name, and the name that he's given is the God speaks and lives. The God speaks and lives. And because God is speaking through Joseph, and this God is living and alive. It's not Joseph, but it's the God in whom he worships and serves. You and I have to understand and remember that 13 years have passed since he was sold into slavery until this promotion. 13 years Joseph has been in this school of waiting. And with that came a lot of wisdom of waiting on God, waiting on God. And he becomes a family man. He has two sons in verses 50 and 52. Manasseh, which means forget, that it means the one who brings about forgetfulness, that he is forgetting about all that's happened to him. And then Ephraim means to bear fruit. It's a plural word, and the Hebrew translation says, God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. And basically how it could be translated is, I have been twice fruitful. I have received multiple blessings. Can you and I say that after all? If we went through 13 years of what Joseph went through, and now Joseph is able to say, I have been blessed immeasurably. I have been blessed immeasurably. What wisdom Joseph gained through the waiting. And then in verses 53 through 57, God's preparation of Joseph is now reaping the benefits. You see, God's plan is right on time. He knew when this famine was coming. He knew all that was about to come to pass. And Gene Getz says, Joseph passed each test. He learned from each experience and performed his duties faithfully and successfully. And so that's his wisdom that we can take away from Joseph is to perform our duties and with faithfulness and with success. And then in chapter 42, 1 through 9, his brothers come. We see his brothers appear. There's no food in the land. Now we see that Joseph's dreams or Joseph's prophecy is coming to fruition at this particular time. And I think it's interesting in chapter 42, 18 through 20, is that Joseph is discerning, or he's testing whether his brothers have really changed. I think in the background, that's what's really happened. His concern for his brothers is the condition of their heart. Has their heart changed? Have they become different? And in verses 21 through 24, this is just a heart-wrenching story with his brothers. One H.C. Loophole commented, they admit guilt. The only, and this is the only acknowledgement of sin in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. And in verse 25 through 28, what is God doing? You know, they begin to tremble violently due to the fact that uh, God is beginning to deal with their guilt as they begin to have to relive that, and you know, in their conscience that maybe has just been in neutral. They've just forgotten it, and now it's being brought to the surface, and so they begin to have a whole new perspective. And Jacob's response when his sons returned in verse chapter 42, 36 through 38, it should have been a teachable moment, such as, did God have a plan or some unexpected opportunity? But he responds in fear and uncertainty. And so eventually he sends his sons back. They're plagued with guilt. The brothers may have felt like, well, you know, God is out to get us. Then in verses 18 through 22 of chapter 43, Swindoll said that comments that they were paralyzed by guilt. They feared the worst when Joseph, dominated by grace, was planning the best. And that is the wisdom that Joseph learned. And then it comes to the point where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in chapter 45. He says, please come closer to me. Please come closer to me. Now, this word closer is an intimate closeness for the purpose of embracing or kissing someone. So he wants for them to come closer. And then in verse 5, he says, he explains to them, you know, God sent me ahead of you to preserve you. If it hadn't have been for that, then we would all be dead. You know, this whole region, everyone would die. And then in chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph would tell them again, but God intended it for good purpose, so he could preserve the lives of many people. You know, as we journey through life, we need to recognize that God is doing in us, or remember what God is doing in us through all things. It is a journey, and he is working in our life. And I think what we need to ask ourselves the question as we close this brief time of the life of Joseph is, you know, as we do go through life, or do we recognize what God is doing in our life? And then how we gain wisdom through waiting is all a matter of perspective. Joseph's perspective is that God was with him, and God helped him to succeed and to be prosperous, and to, even in those difficult times of being a slave and those kinds of things. And so in closing, we are either going to have a worldly perspective or we're going to have a godly perspective when we go through times of waiting. We may pray and pray and pray, and we still have to wait, and God doesn't answer our prayer in the way that we should. And so the wisdom is, what is our perspective? Is our perspective that God is going to provide for us, that God is preparing us through the difficult times in which we may be going through? So I hope this has been a brief and quick word of encouragement for you. I hope that you'll take time to read through these last few chapters of Genesis and learn more and more about what God may be saying and trying to say to you and through you as you are gaining wisdom in the waiting. May God bless, and maybe we can be together next year for Emmy. Thanks a lot.